The scream had come from the direction of Riverside Manor's eastern grounds, beyond the formal gardens where Mrs. Pemberton's guests had been confined by the invisible but absolute boundaries of social propriety. For a moment, the assembled company stood frozen, teacups suspended halfway to lips, conversations arrested mid-sentence. Then, as though released from a spell, they began to move. Some toward the sound, others instinctively backward, as though danger might radiate outward like ripples in a pond. Miss Marple set down her cup with deliberate care, noting the way her hands remained perfectly steady. This small fact about herself had always struck her as mildly amusing. One could witness the dissolution of order, the intrusion of chaos into a carefully maintained social structure, and still possess the ability to place a teacup precisely upon its saucer. She rose with the unhurried grace of a woman who had long ago ceased to be surprised by human calamity. Dr. Harrison was already moving toward the gate, his medical instincts overriding the social conventions that might have otherwise kept him rooted to the lawn. His wife called after him ineffectually, her bright smile finally fracturing into something resembling genuine emotion. The vicar followed, his clerical collar suddenly seeming like a uniform designed specifically for moments of crisis. Gerald Thistleton hesitated. That brief, telling hesitation that suggested he was calculating the social advantages and disadvantages of involvement before committing himself to action. Sophie Ashton had moved toward the gate with the purposefulness of someone accustomed to direct action. Miss Marple found this interesting. The girl did not shriek, did not clutch at her companions, did not perform the theatrical distress that younger women of Riverside might have felt obligated to produce. Instead, she simply walked as though responding to a summons. Mrs. Pemberton stood in the center of her garden, momentarily bereft of speech, a condition so foreign to her nature that she appeared to be experiencing a minor stroke. She looked about her as though betrayed by her own roses. The second scream came almost immediately after the first, though this time Miss Marple could discern that it was Thomas Wickham doing the screaming. That too was interesting. Not the fact of his screaming. Men did scream when circumstances warranted, but the particular quality of it. There was anguish in that cry, yes, but also something else, something approaching fury. By the time Miss Marple reached the gate, moving at a pace that suggested she was merely taking an evening constitutional rather than investigating potential mayhem, a crowd had already begun to assemble. Dr. Harrison was kneeling beside a figure sprawled upon the gravel path. The figure was wearing a pale green dress. The pale green dress was becoming considerably less pale, darkening at the shoulder in a manner that could only signify serious injury. Rachel Wickham lay upon the gravel as though she had simply decided to rest there, her blonde hair spread about her head in an arrangement that might have been artistic if it had not been for the blood beginning to pool beneath her left shoulder. Her eyes were open, fixed upon some point beyond the immediate world, and her breathing had taken on that labored, wet quality that medical professionals recognize with grim efficiency. "Telephone for an ambulance," Dr. Harrison said, his voice assuming the tone of absolute command that illness and injury seemed to grant physicians. "At once." Gerald Thistleton immediately produced a modern cellular telephone from his jacket pocket, a device that still struck many in Riverside as evidence of excessive modernity, and began to dial with fingers that trembled slightly. Whether this trembling derived from shock or some other emotion, Miss Marple could not yet determine. Thomas Wickham stood beside Rachel's body, his face the color of old chalk, his breathing rapid and shallow. He held his hands before him as though uncertain whether they truly belonged to him. There was blood upon those hands, Miss Marple noted. Not a great deal, but enough to confirm that he had knelt beside his fallen colleague before anyone else had arrived. "What happened?" The vicar's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Good heavens, what has happened here?" "She's been struck," Dr. Harrison said tersely, his professional tone cutting through the gathering panic like a knife through silk. "The shoulder, possibly the ribs as well. There's considerable internal bleeding." "Who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice had risen to an almost hysterical pitch. "Here, in Riverside, who would commit such violence?" Miss Marple observed Thomas Wickham's face as he listened to these words. She watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes darted toward the garden gate, toward the lane beyond, as though calculating escape routes. She noticed his shoes. The right one bore a smudge of something dark against the heel. Mud, possibly, or something less innocent. "The police must be informed," the vicar said. "We must contact Inspector Blackwood immediately." The garden party had transformed, in the space of perhaps 60 seconds, from an exercise in refined social ritual into a scene of genuine tragedy. The roses continued to bloom with their perfect, indifferent beauty. The lanterns swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and Rachel Wickham, the groundskeeper's daughter, lay upon the gravel path with her life draining away into the English earth, while around her gathered a circle of suspects who did not yet understand that they had become exactly that. Miss Marple returned her gaze to the garden gate, still standing slightly ajar, and smiled very faintly to herself. The ambulance arrived with admirable speed, its arrival announced by the wailing of sirens that seemed to shatter the rural tranquility of Riverside with particular violence. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, their professional competence a stark contrast to the paralyzed confusion of the garden party guests. They worked on Rachel Wickham with the focused intensity of individuals who had long ago ceased to distinguish between tragedy and routine, administering oxygen, establishing intravenous access, and speaking in the abbreviated medical shorthand that transformed human suffering into manageable clinical problems. By the time they lifted her into the ambulance, Rachel had regained a degree of consciousness, though whether this constituted an improvement remained debatable. Her eyes moved without focus, and her lips formed words that never quite materialized into coherent speech. Dr. Harrison climbed into the ambulance with her, his professional obligation overriding whatever social complications such an action might ordinarily have entailed. The garden party, what remained of it, had begun to dissolve into fragments of anxious conversation. Mrs. Pemberton moved among her guests like a hostess still attempting to maintain standards despite the obvious collapse of civilization. She offered tea, which no one desired. She suggested that guests might wish to retire to the drawing room, as though the attempted murder of a young woman were merely an inconvenient weather interruption. It was Inspector Blackwood who arrived next, in an unmarked car that suggested Scotland Yard rather than the modest police constabulary that typically served Riverside's limited criminal needs. He was a man of perhaps 50, with the particular combination of weariness and sharp observation that suggested decades spent in pursuit of human misbehavior. His eyes, gray and calculating, swept across the assembled company with the efficiency of someone accustomed to identifying lies. "I'm Inspector Blackwood," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually. Who discovered the victim?" Thomas Wickham stepped forward, his earlier pallor having intensified into something approaching corpse-like. "I did," he said, his voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "I heard a sound and came to investigate. She was already on the ground." "You heard a sound?" Blackwood's pen was already in motion, his notebook acquiring the appearance of a confessor's ledger. "What sort of sound?" "A cry," Wickham said. "A shout, perhaps. I wasn't entirely certain. I came to the gate and saw her lying there." "And you touched her?" This was posed as a question, but the inspector's tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes. I knelt beside her to see if she was alive. I placed my hands on her shoulder, trying to assess." Wickham's voice trailed away, awareness of the blood upon his hands, apparently overwhelming him anew. Miss Marple observed this exchange with the attention normally reserved for matters of genuine significance. She noted the slight inconsistency in Wickham's account. He had said he heard a sound, Yet the scream that had alerted the garden party guests had been quite unmistakable, hardly subtle enough to require interpretation. She registered the way his eyes continued to dart toward the gate, as though something beyond it retained his particular interest. "The gate," she said quietly, her voice insufficiently loud to interrupt the inspector's interrogation, yet somehow possessing the quality of a bell struck in an empty room. "I believe someone should examine the gate." Inspector Blackwood turned to regard her with the expression of a man who has just noticed a piece of furniture beginning to speak. "And you are?" "Miss Jane Marple. I reside in Riverside. I was attending Mrs. Pemberton's garden party." "Did you observe anything relevant to this incident, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple considered the question with the apparent seriousness it deserved, though her answer emerged with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. "The gate was closed when I arrived. It was standing ajar when the scream occurred. Rather odd, don't you think? If Mr. Wickham heard a sound from beyond the gate, wouldn't one expect the gate to have been already open? And yet it appears to have been opened only recently, judging by the undisturbed dust upon the hinges." The inspector's expression underwent a subtle transformation, recognition flickering across his features as he registered that he was in the presence of someone accustomed to genuine observation, rather than merely stumbling through life in a state of aesthetic appreciation. Gerald Thistleton seized upon this shift in focus with practiced ease. "Miss Marple is quite right," he said, his charm returning to his voice now that suspicion had begun to redirect itself. "Perhaps whoever attacked Rachel fled through that gate. Someone from outside the party entirely." "Possibly," Inspector Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he found such theories considerably less probable than one might have hoped. He gestured to one of his officers, a young constable whose enthusiasm appeared to exceed his experience. "Examine the gate and the grounds beyond. Look for anything that might indicate the passage of a second party." As the constable departed on his assignment, Miss Marple permitted herself to turn her gaze once more toward Thomas Wickham. He was watching the inspector with the intensity of someone calculating odds, his hands now clenching and unclenching with rhythmic regularity. The blood remained upon his fingers, dried now into dark crescents beneath his nails. She wondered, with the idle curiosity that had served her so well through decades of village observation, whether Wickham had truly discovered Rachel Wickham unconscious upon the gravel, or whether he had perhaps been responsible for placing her there. Inspector Blackwood established himself in Mrs. Pemberton's drawing-room, transforming that chamber of refined leisure into something approximating an interrogation suite. The constable, who had been dispatched to examine the gate, returned within 20 minutes, his expression suggesting that whatever he had discovered had complicated rather than clarified the investigation. He whispered something to the inspector, whose eyes narrowed with the particular intensity of someone confronting an unexpected development. "The gate shows signs of recent use," Blackwood announced to the assembled company. "Muddy footprints consistent with someone having passed through it shortly before the assault. However, and this is the curious part, the footprints appear to lead away from Riverside Manor toward the lane, not toward it. Whoever passed through that gate did so after the attack, not before." This revelation produced the precise effect one might have predicted. Mrs. Pemberton gasped as though personally betrayed by geography. Sophie Ashton's expression shifted from mild amusement to genuine interest. Gerald Thistleton began the process of calculating how this new information might be deployed to his advantage, and Thomas Wickham's face underwent a transformation so dramatic that even the inspector seemed to register its significance. "What does that mean, precisely?" the vicar asked, his clerical concern for accuracy overriding any other consideration. "It means," Miss Marple said, in the tone of someone clarifying a minor point of village history, "that the person who attacked Rachel Wickham did not flee through that gate. The footprints were made after the assault, perhaps considerably after, which suggests that whoever made those footprints was not, in fact, Rachel's attacker." The inspector regarded Miss Marple with the expression of a man discovering an unexpected ally. "Precisely. Which raises the question of who made those footprints and why. Mr. Wickham, you were found beside the victim. Did you notice anyone else in the vicinity, anyone leaving the grounds? Wickham's response emerged after a pause that extended just slightly too long to suggest spontaneity. No, I saw no one. When I heard the sound, I came immediately. There was only Rachel. And yet someone passed through that gate, Blackwood said, his tone suggesting something less than complete faith in Wickham's account. Someone made those footprints. Someone was here, in the vicinity of the assault, after it occurred. Sophie Ashton spoke for the first time since the crisis had begun to unfold. Her voice carried the measured quality of someone accustomed to speaking with precision. What if it wasn't one person? What if there were two? One who attacked Rachel and another who discovered her and passed through the gate. That would explain the footprints leading away. An astute observation, the inspector conceded. Though it does rather multiply the complications, doesn't it? We now have not one but potentially two unknown individuals present at the scene. Miss Marple, however, found herself considering an alternative interpretation. She had spent sufficient years observing human behavior to recognize that the simplest explanation often concealed a far more complex reality. The footprints, leading away from the manor rather than toward it, suggested someone departing rather than arriving. Someone who had reason to establish their presence at the scene after the fact, then retreat to the relative anonymity of the lane. She rose with the studied deliberation that characterized her movements and approached the window overlooking the gardens. From this vantage point, one could observe the gate in question, still standing slightly ajar, and beyond it, the country lane that connected Riverside Manor to the broader network of rural paths. "Has anyone inquired," she asked conversationally, "whether Rachel Wickham's injury might have been self-inflicted?" The silence that followed this question possessed an almost tangible quality. Even the inspector ceased his note-taking, his pen suspended above his notebook as though struck by sudden paralysis. "Self-inflicted." Mrs. Pemberton's voice emerged at a pitch suggesting the suggestion had offended her sensibilities as profoundly as a declaration of atheism might have. "Surely you're not suggesting the girl stabbed herself?" "Not stabbed," Miss Marple corrected gently, "but struck, certainly, with sufficient force to cause the injury we observed. Young people are sometimes capable of remarkable violence when motivated by appropriate desperation." "What possible motivation could Rachel Wickham possess?" the vicar demanded. "She was a pleasant enough girl, respectable family, despite her circumstances." "Precisely," Miss Marple said, turning from the window to regard the assembled company. "Respectable family, modest circumstances, limited prospects. The sort of situation that might have driven a young woman toward rather dramatic solutions, particularly if she had discovered herself to be in a condition that would render those limited prospects considerably more constrained." Sophie Ashton's eyes widened with something approaching recognition. Gerald Thistleton's expression hardened into something resembling calculation, and Thomas Wickham's hands, which had momentarily ceased their anxious clenching, began once more to contract and release with rhythmic intensity. "Are you suggesting," Inspector Blackwood said slowly, "that Rachel Wickham attempted to harm herself?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that we possess very little reliable evidence regarding either Rachel's intentions or the sequence of events that led to her present condition. And I'm suggesting further that assumptions based upon immediate appearances may prove considerably less reliable than careful observation of the various inconsistencies that surround this incident." The inspector regarded her with the expression of someone who had just discovered a previously unknown room in a familiar building. "I believe, Miss Marple, that you and I should have a more extensive conversation about what you observed this afternoon." Inspector Blackwood conducted Miss Marple into Mrs. Pemberton's study, a room decorated in the fashion of someone who believed that leather-bound books conveyed intellectual seriousness regardless of whether they had actually been read. He positioned himself behind the substantial mahogany desk, gesturing for Miss Marple to occupy one of the wingback chairs positioned before it. There was something performative about the arrangement, Miss Marple noted. The inspector establishing hierarchical superiority through furniture placement, a gesture that suggested insecurity rather than genuine authority. "You've observed something that the rest of us have missed," Blackwood began, his tone carrying a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. "I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts regarding Rachel Wickham's alleged self-injury. It's not, I confess, a conclusion I've encountered with particular frequency in my years investigating violent crime." Miss Marple settled into the wingback chair with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned long ago that discomfort often preceded insight. "I didn't precisely suggest self-injury, Inspector. Rather, I suggested that we examine our assumptions regarding the sequence of events. You see, I've observed something rather peculiar in the behavior of several of the garden party guests." "Continue," Blackwood prompted, his pen resuming its motion across the notebook. "Thomas Wickham's hands," Miss Marple said. "When I observed him immediately after the assault, they bore only a modest quantity of blood, considerably less than one would expect if he had struck Rachel Wickham with sufficient force to cause her present injuries. When one strikes another person with violence sufficient to penetrate the shoulder and cause internal bleeding, the attacker typically acquires considerably more blood upon their person. Yet Mr. Wickham's shirt remains relatively unstained. He claims to have discovered her already injured," Blackwood pointed out. "Indeed. But consider the alternative. What if Mr. Wickham and Rachel Wickham were both present at the gate when the injury occurred, but neither was responsible for inflicting it? What if a third party, someone we have not yet identified, struck Rachel, then departed through that gate, leaving footprints in the mud precisely as we observed?" "Three parties," Blackwood mused. "The attacker, Rachel, and Wickham. Yet only Wickham was present when the rest of you arrived." "Which suggests," Miss Marple continued, her voice acquiring the quality of someone discussing the particular challenges involved in maintaining a garden, "that either Wickham departed and returned, or the injury occurred considerably earlier than we have assumed. Perhaps Rachel was struck before the garden party reached its crescendo. Perhaps she managed to leave the scene, attempting to reach the house for assistance, and was discovered by Mr. Wickham only as she was collapsing." The inspector's expression suggested this interpretation had acquired a certain plausibility in his calculations. That would explain the footprints. Someone other than Wickham passing through the gate, perhaps immediately after the assault. "And it would further suggest," Miss Marple added, "that Rachel Wickham possessed knowledge regarding her attacker's identity. Knowledge sufficient to explain why she attempted to conceal the incident rather than immediately report it to the authorities. You believe she recognized her attacker?" "I believe she knew her attacker well enough to make reporting the incident a complicated matter," Miss Marple replied. "Consider, Inspector, the vulnerability of a young woman in Rachel's position. Limited prospects, modest social standing, dependent upon employment for survival. If she were struck by someone in a position of authority over her, someone whose goodwill she required for continued employment or social respectability, she might well choose to minimize the incident rather than risk the consequences of formal accusation." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking with theatrical significance. "You're suggesting someone from Riverside Manor? Someone employing her?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we examine the relationships between Rachel Wickham and the various individuals present at Mrs. Pemberton's garden party. You see, Inspector, the curious aspect of this entire situation is not that Rachel was attacked, but rather the manner in which the attack occurred. A violent assault in broad daylight, witnessed by no one, occurring just beyond the boundaries of a social gathering. That suggests either considerable desperation on the attacker's part, or considerable confidence that the attack would remain undetected. And what determines confidence in this case? Knowledge of the victim's likely response, Miss Marple said. Confidence that Rachel Wickham would not immediately report the assault to the authorities, which suggests a relationship of sufficient complexity that public accusations would present complications for both parties. The inspector rose from behind the desk and began to pace, his motion suggesting the internal processes of calculation that occurred when multiple theories began to demand coherent integration. "I'll need to speak with Rachel Wickham herself. The hospital reports indicate she's regained consciousness. If she can identify her attacker, this becomes considerably more straightforward." "A logical approach," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I confess I suspect Rachel Wickham may prove reluctant to provide such identification. Fear, Inspector, is a remarkably efficient silencer. Young women in precarious circumstances frequently prioritize survival over justice." "Then I shall need to ensure her safety," Blackwood said firmly. "No victim will be intimidated into silence while under official protection." "An admirable sentiment," Miss Marple observed, "though I wonder whether you've considered that official protection might itself constitute a form of intimidation. After all, if Rachel Wickham fears that publicly identifying her attacker might result in consequences for her family or for others she cares about, then police protection, however well-intentioned, may actually encourage her silence." The inspector halted his pacing, recognizing in Miss Marple's observation the outline of a truth that complicated his investigation considerably. The assault on Rachel Wickham was not merely a crime of violence. It was something far more complex, a situation wherein fear, obligation, and desperate circumstance had woven themselves into a tapestry sufficiently intricate to defeat straightforward investigation. By the time Miss Marple and Inspector Blackwood concluded their conversation in Mrs. Pemberton's study, the afternoon had surrendered to evening with the particular finality that characterizes English rural twilight. The garden party had entirely dissolved, its guests dispersed to their various residences, carrying with them the delicious burden of scandal that would sustain conversation in Riverside for months to come. Mrs. Pemberton had retreated to her drawing-room, where she remained occupied in the serious business of reconstructing events for the benefit of those guests unfortunate enough to have departed before the assault occurred. Inspector Blackwood departed for the hospital, his intention being to speak with Rachel Wickham before she could be influenced by whatever external pressures Riverside society might inevitably bring to bear. Miss Marple, however, chose to remain, accepting Mrs. Pemberton's somewhat desperate invitation to take tea in the drawing-room. The widow seemed to require the presence of a sympathetic listener, though whether this sympathy derived from genuine concern or the social insurance provided by association with someone of Miss Marple's evident intelligence remained an open question. "It's extraordinary," Mrs. Pemberton said, for perhaps the 15th time, her blue silk dress now somewhat wilted from the afternoon's exertions. "In all my years residing in Riverside, nothing of this nature has occurred. We are a respectable community. Violence is simply not the sort of thing that happens here." "Violence occurs everywhere," Miss Marple replied gently, her teacup suspended at a precise distance from her lips. "It merely wears different disguises depending upon the setting. In London, it announces itself with considerable violence. In a village like Riverside, it often masquerades as social convention, professional obligation, or familial duty." Mrs. Pemberton regarded her with the expression of someone who suspects they've been insulted but cannot quite determine the precise nature of the affront. "I'm not entirely certain what you mean." "I suspect," Miss Marple continued, "that someone in Riverside has been harboring considerable resentment toward Rachel Wickham. Resentment sufficient to overcome the ordinary social inhibitions that typically prevent violence. What we observed this afternoon was merely the physical manifestation of tensions that have been accumulating for some considerable time." "But Rachel is such a pleasant girl," Mrs. Pemberton protested. "Well-behaved, quiet, causes no trouble. Who could possibly resent her?" "That," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is the question that Inspector Blackwood will eventually require answering. Though I suspect the answer may surprise you, Mrs. Pemberton. You see, there are particular types of young women that provoke resentment in their communities regardless of their individual merits. Young women who possess youth itself, who possess possibilities that older women have relinquished, who represent alternatives that others did not pursue." "You're suggesting jealousy," Mrs. Pemberton's tone carried the particular indignation of someone whose own jealousies had been gently exposed. Before Miss Marple could respond, a knock at the drawing-room door interrupted the conversation. The constable who had examined the gate entered, his uniform bearing evidence of his earlier investigation, mud upon his trousers, grass stains upon his sleeves. He carried something wrapped in a handkerchief, which he presented to Miss Marple with evident significance. "Inspector Blackwood requested that you examine this," the constable said. "Found it approximately 15 yards beyond the gate, partially concealed beneath a hedgerow. We believe it may be the weapon used in the assault." Miss Marple accepted the handkerchief-wrapped object with the careful deliberation it warranted. When she carefully unfolded the fabric, she revealed a gardening tool of modest size, a cultivator, the sort employed for breaking up compacted soil. Its handle bore traces of blood, now dried and darkened, though the quantity was considerably less than one might have expected given the severity of Rachel's injury. "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "A gardening tool. Riverside Manor's grounds are extensive, I understand. Such implements would be present in considerable quantity. And this particular tool shows evidence of deliberate concealment, does it not? It was not simply dropped in haste. Someone took the trouble to carry it some distance from the scene of the assault before secreting it beneath a hedgerow." "That suggests premeditation," Mrs. Pemberton said, her earlier indignation transforming into something approaching genuine concern. "Someone came prepared to do violence. Or, Miss Marple observed, someone simply seized an implement that was at hand and subsequently attempted to dispose of it in a manner they believed would prevent discovery. Such actions often suggest panic rather than careful planning." The constable cleared his throat with evident discomfort. "Inspector Blackwood will want to process the weapon formally, but he thought you might observe something that could prove useful." "What I observe," Miss Marple said carefully, rewrapping the cultivator in its handkerchief, "is that someone in Riverside has attempted to separate themselves from this crime by disposing of the weapon. They believe that by removing the physical instrument of violence from the scene, they have removed themselves from culpability. But such reasoning overlooks the most fundamental truth about human nature, Constable. People always leave evidence of themselves behind, regardless of how carefully they attempt to conceal their actions." "What sort of evidence?" the constable asked. "The evidence that matters most," Miss Marple replied. "Motive, opportunity, and most importantly, the particular manner in which they attempt to conceal their guilt. You see, the guilty always make a critical error. They attempt to control the narrative surrounding their crime, to direct attention toward alternative suspects or explanations, but in doing so, they invariably reveal far more than they conceal." That evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage through the darkening lanes of Riverside, she found herself contemplating the various ways in which human beings betrayed themselves through their attempts at deception. The weapon had been discarded with care. The footprints had been left in muddy soil. And somewhere in Riverside, someone was experiencing the particular anxiety that accompanies the commission of violence, the gnawing awareness that discovery remained only a matter of time. The following morning arrived with the particular grayness that characterizes English weather when weather itself seems uncertain whether to commit to rain or merely threaten it perpetually. Miss Marple had slept poorly, her mind occupied with the various inconsistencies surrounding Rachel Wickham's assault. She rose early, as was her custom, and positioned herself in her small garden with a cup of tea, observing the roses with the attention normally reserved for matters of genuine importance. It was at approximately 8 o'clock that the post arrived, delivered by young Timothy Graves, the village postman who possessed the unfortunate habit of treating every delivery as an opportunity for extended conversation. Today, however, Timothy's usual garrulousness had been replaced by the sort of hushed excitement that suggested news of genuine magnitude. "You've heard, I expect," Timothy said, his tone managing to convey both sympathy and intense curiosity, "about Rachel Wickham regaining consciousness at the hospital." "I had not heard," Miss Marple replied, though her expression suggested she had anticipated precisely such a development. Has she been able to identify her attacker? That's the curious part, Timothy said, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper despite the absence of any audience beyond Miss Marple's roses. She's refused to speak to anyone, not the police, not her family, not even the vicar who visited her this morning. She simply lies there, staring at the ceiling, refusing all conversation. Interesting, Miss Marple observed. Fear is a remarkably efficient silencer, Timothy. When someone has been subjected to violence, they often find themselves unable to articulate the experience, particularly if they harbor complicated feelings toward their attacker. Timothy departed shortly thereafter, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate this development. Fear combined with silence suggested not random violence, but something far more complex, a situation wherein the victim possessed knowledge that complicated the simple narrative of assault and investigation. Rachel's refusal to speak indicated she was protecting someone, or perhaps protecting herself from the consequences of identification. By mid-morning, Inspector Blackwood arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, his appearance suggesting a night spent in pursuit of information rather than rest. He accepted tea with evident gratitude and settled into Miss Marple's sitting room with the posture of a man in need of perspective. "Rachel Wickham has provided us with a description," he announced, "though not as you might expect of the person who attacked her. Instead, she's described what she was doing at the time of the assault. According to her account, she was meeting someone at the gate, a secret meeting, apparently, which explains her presence in that particular location at that particular moment." "And did she describe the person she was meeting?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer. "She refused," Blackwood said grimly. When pressed regarding the identity of her mysterious visitor, she simply closed her eyes and would not respond. The hospital staff eventually requested that we cease our interrogation. They were concerned about her physical recovery. "Physical recovery from what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She was struck once, with sufficient force to cause injury, but not life-threatening injury. The hospital would not ordinarily restrict police investigation based upon a single assault. Unless, of course, there are additional complications regarding her condition." Inspector Blackwood's expression underwent a subtle transformation, recognition of Miss Marple's meaning becoming evident in his features. "The pregnancy," he said quietly. "She's carrying a child. The hospital staff is concerned that stress and trauma might precipitate complications." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Which, of course, explains everything regarding Rachel's behavior. She was meeting someone, the child's father, one presumes, at the gate. Someone who apparently struck her, then departed, leaving her to collapse upon the gravel." "But why?" Blackwood demanded. "Why would the father of her child strike her? Why would Rachel protect him by refusing to provide identification?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "Rachel Wickham faces a future considerably more constrained than those of us with greater social flexibility can easily comprehend. An unmarried woman carrying a child in Riverside faces not merely social ostracism, but economic catastrophe. If the father is someone of social standing, someone whose reputation would also be damaged by public acknowledgement of the pregnancy, then Rachel might well calculate that her interests are better served by silence than by justice." "She's protecting her attacker," Blackwood said, his tone carrying the particular frustration of someone confronting the logical conclusions of human behavior while simultaneously finding those conclusions morally reprehensible. "She's protecting herself," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You see, Inspector, if Rachel were to publicly identify her attacker, the ensuing scandal would ensure that no respectable man in Riverside would subsequently marry her, regardless of her circumstances. She would become permanently marked by association with violence. Her attacker, by contrast, would likely face relatively modest consequences, a fine perhaps, or a brief period of confinement. Rachel is calculating, quite rationally, that her interests are better served by maintaining silence. But she was assaulted, Blackwood protested. Violently struck. The assailant must face justice. Justice, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, is a concept that carries different meanings depending upon one's social position. For someone in Rachel's circumstances, justice might simply mean the opportunity to maintain her employment, her reputation, and her possibility of future marriage, even if that marriage must occur under circumstances considerably less ideal than she might have anticipated. Inspector Blackwood departed Miss Marple's cottage an hour later, carrying with him both tea and a growing sense that Rachel Wickham's assault was connected to something far more complex than a simple act of violence. That evening, as Miss Marple worked in her garden, deadheading roses with practiced precision, she found herself contemplating the various ways in which human beings sacrifice justice for the sake of survival. And she wondered, with the particular clarity that comes from decades of observation, which of the men present at Mrs. Pemberton's garden party possessed both sufficient motive and sufficient desperation to strike a pregnant woman, then retreat into the comfortable fiction of innocence. 3 days elapsed between Rachel Wickham's refusal to identify her attacker and the discovery of the second body. 3 days during which Riverside settled into a state of anxious speculation, during which rumors multiplied with the vigor of weeds in an untended garden, during which various residents of the village found themselves subjected to increasingly pointed questions regarding their movements on the afternoon of the garden party. It was Gerald Thistleton's housekeeper who discovered him, sprawled across the Persian rug in his study with an empty glass of brandy positioned on the side table and an expression of serene finality carved into his features. The coroner's preliminary assessment suggested barbiturates in considerable quantity, administered either voluntarily or with such skillful deception that distinguishing between the two became a matter of considerable philosophical complexity rather than forensic certainty. Inspector Blackwood arrived at Thistleton Manor with the expression of a man who suspects that an investigation has just undergone a fundamental transformation. Miss Marple, summoned by the constable, who seemed to have developed the habit of consulting her regarding matters that confused him, found herself studying the body of Gerald Thistleton with the attention normally reserved for objects of genuine significance. "Suicide," Blackwood announced, his tone carrying the particular certainty of someone who desperately hoped that such a conclusion might be accurate. Guilt-stricken, he consumed a fatal quantity of barbiturates. The case is closed. "Is it?" Miss Marple inquired gently. She knelt beside the body with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had begun to protest such actions, examining Thistleton's hands with particular attention. "Tell me, Inspector, how does one administer barbiturates to oneself in such quantity while simultaneously maintaining sufficient consciousness to position oneself decoratively upon a Persian rug?" Blackwood's expression suggested the question had acquired uncomfortable resonance. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that Gerald Thistleton did not consume this brandy voluntarily. The glass contains no fingerprints. I observe the surface is entirely smooth, quite unlike what one would expect if someone had gripped it tightly while drinking. Someone else placed this glass beside Mr. Thistleton's body after his death, an action suggesting either a rather elaborate staging or a murderer of considerable theatrical inclination." "You believe Thistleton was murdered?" Blackwood's tone carried the particular resistance of someone confronting a complication that destroys the narrative he had hoped to construct. "I believe," Miss Marple said, rising with evident difficulty, "that we have been observing this situation from precisely the wrong perspective. We have focused upon Rachel Wickham's assault, assuming it was an isolated incident. But what if Rachel's assault and Gerald Thistleton's death are connected? What if they represent two manifestations of a single underlying conflict?" "You're suggesting Thistleton attacked Rachel?" Blackwood demanded. "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, that Gerald Thistleton possessed considerable charm and considerably less moral constraint regarding the exercise of that charm. A man of his social position, his financial security, his practiced ability to manipulate others, such a man might well have pursued a young woman of Rachel's circumstances without particular regard for her preferences or her situation. If Thistleton fathered Rachel's child, then someone who cared about Rachel, or who cared about the reputation of someone associated with Rachel, might have decided that Thistleton required permanent removal from consideration. Miss Marple finished, a father protective of his daughter, a brother concerned about his sister. Or perhaps a man who harbored his own affection for Rachel and discovered that she was carrying another man's child. Inspector Blackwood's comprehension arrived with visible force. Thomas Wickham, Rachel's distant cousin. He works as the estate manager at Riverside Manor. He would have known Thistleton, would have been present when Thistleton engaged in his various manipulations. And he would have possessed both motive and opportunity, Miss Marple confirmed. Consider, Inspector. Rachel was at the gate to meet someone who struck her with sufficient force to cause her injury, someone she subsequently refused to identify. What if that someone was Thomas Wickham? What if Thomas discovered Rachel was pregnant with Thistleton's child and struck her in a moment of passionate distress? But that would make Wickham the attacker, not— Blackwood halted, comprehension completing itself. And then Wickham, consumed by guilt regarding his actions toward Rachel, murdered Thistleton in retaliation, a delayed act of justice performed after considerable internal struggle. Possibly, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested reservations regarding such a straightforward conclusion. Or, alternatively, someone killed Thistleton because they believed Thistleton had attacked Rachel. Someone who discovered the assault, assumed Thistleton was responsible, and decided that justice required his permanent removal. Who would do such a thing? Blackwood demanded. Someone with access to barbiturates, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Someone with sufficient social position to invite Thistleton to his residence without arousing suspicion. Someone who could position themselves to deliver a fatal dose to his brandy without Thistleton registering the action as unusual. Someone who understood theatrical staging sufficiently to attempt to construct a narrative of suicide. Inspector Blackwood began to pace, his motion suggesting the internal processes of investigation undertaken under conditions of considerable complexity. That describes any number of individuals in Riverside. The doctor, certainly. Mrs. Pemberton, who maintains considerable social leverage. Even the vicar, who might possess pharmaceutical knowledge from his pastoral duties. Indeed, Miss Marple said. Which is why we must examine not merely who possessed access to barbiturates, but who possessed the particular emotional investment in Rachel Wickham that would motivate such action. We must identify, in other words, not who had the capacity to murder Gerald Thistleton, but who had the motive. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the increasingly complex tapestry of Riverside secrets, she found herself reflecting upon the particular dangers of small communities. In cities, one could conceal oneself within anonymity. But in villages, everyone knew everyone, and secrets festered beneath the surface of social convention, with the inevitability of infection beneath a sealed wound. Rachel's assault and Gerald Thistleton's death were not isolated crimes. They were the eruption into visibility of conflicts that had been accumulating for years, waiting only for the proper catalyst to explode into violence. The toxicology report confirmed barbiturates of sufficient quantity to render Gerald Thistleton unconscious within minutes and deceased within the hour. The coroner's office, initially committed to the suicide narrative, reluctantly acknowledged that the absence of fingerprints on the brandy glass suggested alternative explanations. The investigation, which Blackwood had hoped to conclude, instead expanded into something considerably more elaborate and considerably more troubling. Miss Marple received a visitor on the fourth morning following Thistleton's discovery. Dr. Harrison appeared at her cottage door with the expression of a man wrestling with profound internal conflict, his professional composure deteriorating at the edges like watercolor paint subjected to unexpected rain. She invited him inside with the practiced courtesy of someone accustomed to receiving confessions, gesturing toward the sitting room where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains in patterns of deliberate complexity. "I've come regarding the barbiturates," Dr. Harrison began without preamble, his voice carrying the particular hoarseness of someone who had rehearsed this conversation extensively without achieving satisfaction. "Inspector Blackwood has been asking about pharmaceutical access, about who in Riverside might have obtained such quantities. I felt compelled to come to you first, Miss Marple, rather than directly to the authorities." "That suggests you possess knowledge that complicates such direct revelation," Miss Marple observed gently. "Knowledge that might implicate yourself or someone you care about." Harrison's face underwent a transformation so dramatic that Miss Marple found herself genuinely concerned for his physical stability. He sank into the nearest chair with the collapse of someone whose internal supports have been suddenly removed. "My daughter," he whispered. "Sophie. She prescribed barbiturates to herself several months ago through channels that were not entirely legitimate. She was experiencing insomnia, stress related to her situation in London. She obtained a supply sufficient for several months' treatment." "Sophie Ashton," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "The vicar's granddaughter, visiting from London. Quite intelligent, quite observant. Quite present at Mrs. Pemberton's garden party. She discovered the pregnancy," Harrison continued, his voice acquiring the particular desperation of confession. "She learned that Rachel Wickham was carrying Gerald Thistleton's child. She became obsessed with the situation, convinced that justice required Thistleton's removal from the world. She believed that if Thistleton were dead, Rachel might have some possibility of recovery, of moving forward without the permanent complication of bearing his child. A curious form of justice," Miss Marple observed. "One that requires the permanent removal of the guilty party, rather than the exercise of legal consequence." "Sophie has always been idealistic," Harrison said, his tone carrying the particular defensiveness of a parent attempting to reconcile their child's actions with their understanding of that child's character. "She came from London with the express purpose of confronting Thistleton, of demanding that he acknowledge his responsibility. When he refused, when he laughed at her attempts to shame him into action, she decided that he required removal." "And the barbiturates?" Miss Marple prompted. "She placed them in his brandy when she visited him at his residence. She had been invited by Thistleton. He was apparently attempting to seduce her, to exercise his particular form of charm upon another young woman. She accepted the invitation with the explicit intention of administering the drug. She then staged the scene to appear as suicide, though I suspect her knowledge of such matters derived more from theatrical sophistication than genuine understanding of death." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, observing the garden beyond with the particular attention she normally reserved for matters of genuine complexity. "And Rachel? The assault upon Rachel Wickham. Did Sophie perpetrate that as well?" "No," Harrison said firmly. "That was Thomas Wickham. He discovered Rachel's condition, realized that Thistleton was responsible, and in a moment of emotional explosion, struck her. He has been tormented by guilt regarding that action ever since. He's prepared to confess, to accept responsibility for assault, but he's adamant that he had nothing to do with Thistleton's death." "Convenient," Miss Marple observed, her tone carrying neither judgment nor approval. "Two separate acts of violence, each committed by a different individual, each motivated by concern for Rachel Wickham. How remarkably human, though perhaps not entirely credible." "What do you mean?" Harrison demanded, rising from his chair with sudden intensity. "Are you suggesting my daughter is lying?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, turning from the window to regard him directly, "that the narrative you have presented contains certain inconsistencies that merit examination. Sophie Ashton possessed access to barbiturates, certainly, But did she possess the particular knowledge required to determine the precise dosage necessary to render Thistleton unconscious while staging the scene to appear as suicide? Such actions require either considerable pharmaceutical training or assistance from someone who possessed such training. Understanding arrived in Harrison's features like the slow dawning of terrible recognition. "Margaret," he whispered, "my wife. She was present when Sophie administered the drug. She assisted in the staging. Oh God, Margaret helped her." "Which suggests," Miss Marple said quietly, "that your wife harbored her own reasons for desiring Gerald Thistleton's demise. Reasons that have nothing to do with Rachel Wickham's pregnancy and everything to do with protecting something considerably more personal." Dr. Harrison's collapse into acknowledgement was swift and absolute. "Margaret's sister," he said quietly. 20 years ago. Thistleton seduced her, promised marriage, then abandoned her when he discovered she was pregnant. The scandal destroyed her. She took her own life. Margaret has never forgotten, never forgiven. When she learned that Thistleton was engaging in similar behavior with Rachel, that history was repeating itself with merciless precision, she saw an opportunity for retribution. "And Sophie?" Miss Marple asked. "Sophie has no knowledge that her mother was involved. She believes she acted alone. She will not understand, when the truth emerges, that her attempt at justice was merely the instrument through which her mother's decades-old resentment finally erupted into action." Miss Marple regarded Dr. Harrison with the expression of someone contemplating the vast complexity of human motivation. "You must inform Inspector Blackwood," she said gently, "both regarding Sophie's actions and regarding your wife's involvement. Justice, whatever its particular form, requires acknowledgement of truth." "If I do," Harrison said, "my wife will face murder charges. My daughter will face charges regarding poisoning. My family will be destroyed." "Your family," Miss Marple replied, "has already been destroyed by the actions that led to this moment. What remains is merely the question of whether that destruction will be acknowledged or concealed." Inspector Blackwood arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within the hour, his expression suggesting that Dr. Harrison had indeed proceeded to the authorities with his confession. The inspector carried with him the particular exhaustion of someone confronting the painful recognition that human motivation rarely conforms to the neat categories established by law and procedure. He accepted tea without comment and settled into the sitting room with the posture of a man in need of guidance. "Harrison has confessed to knowledge of his wife's involvement in Thistleton's death," Blackwood began, without preamble. "He claims Sophie administered the barbiturates without understanding that her mother was facilitating the action. He maintains that Margaret Harrison staged the scene to appear as suicide, utilizing knowledge acquired through decades of marriage to a medical professional. He further claims that Sophie remains ignorant of her mother's participation." "And do you believe him?" Miss Marple inquired. "I believe he's telling the truth as he understands it," Blackwood replied carefully. "But I'm increasingly convinced that the truth as understood by Dr. Harrison differs considerably from the objective facts of the situation. There are inconsistencies in his account that suggest either deliberate deception or profound confusion regarding the actual sequence of events." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "Perhaps you might elaborate regarding these inconsistencies, Inspector. Sometimes an external perspective proves useful in clarifying such matters." Blackwood consulted his notebook, though his expression suggested he had already internalized the relevant details with considerable thoroughness. "Sophie Ashton claims she visited Gerald Thistleton on the afternoon of the garden party, subsequent to the assault on Rachel Wickham. She states she invited herself to his residence under the pretext of discussing an urgent matter. She further claims she administered the barbiturates by dissolving them in his brandy while he was occupied with other concerns." "A remarkably straightforward account," Miss Marple observed. "Straightforward enough to suggest either remarkable honesty or remarkable deception regarding the underlying facts." "Precisely," Blackwood said with evident relief at finding his suspicions validated. However, the timeline presents complications. Sophie was present at Mrs. Pemberton's garden party until the police arrived to investigate Rachel's assault. She subsequently returned to the vicar's residence, where she remained visible to multiple witnesses until approximately 5 o'clock. At that point, she stated she was retiring to her room due to a headache. She emerged at 7 o'clock, at which time she announced her intention to visit Gerald Thistleton regarding a matter of importance. 7 o'clock, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And when was Gerald Thistleton discovered dead? His housekeeper found him at approximately 8:30 the following morning. The coroner estimates death occurred between 8 and 10 o'clock on the evening of the garden party, though such estimates possess a margin of error of several hours. Which means, Miss Marple said slowly, that Sophie Ashton could not have administered the barbiturates at the garden party, as she claims. She was not present at Thistleton's residence until 7 o'clock, and Thistleton was discovered dead the following morning. Unless Sophie administered the drug immediately upon arrival, consuming considerably less than an hour for the drug to take effect. Which is precisely what she claims, Blackwood said. She states she arrived at approximately 7 o'clock, engaged Thistleton in conversation regarding Rachel Wickham's pregnancy, revealed that she had added barbiturates to his brandy, and departed within the hour after confirming he had consumed the poisoned drink. And where did she go after departing Thistleton's residence? Miss Marple asked. Blackwood's expression suggested he had encountered a frustration sufficiently profound to override his professional composure. That is precisely the problem. She claims she returned to the vicar's residence. However, the vicar himself was visiting the hospital, attending to Rachel Wickham's condition. The vicar's housekeeper was occupied in the kitchen. No one can definitively establish Sophie's location between approximately 7:30 and 9 o'clock on the evening in question, which provides her with precisely the temporal window required to commit additional actions, should such actions have been desirable, Miss Marple observed. Tell me, Inspector, did Dr. Harrison confess to knowledge of his wife's involvement, or did his wife confess directly? Dr. Harrison confessed on behalf of both himself and his wife, Blackwood replied. Margaret Harrison has not been interviewed. When officers arrived at the Harrison residence to conduct formal questioning, they discovered her sedated, apparently having consumed barbiturates herself. She remains hospitalized in a condition described as stable, though she has not yet regained consciousness. How remarkably convenient, Miss Marple said quietly. Dr. Harrison provides confession regarding his wife's involvement in murder, and simultaneously his wife becomes unavailable for questioning through the very means that allegedly constituted her method of committing that murder. One might almost suspect orchestration of considerable sophistication. You believe Dr. Harrison is protecting his wife by confessing on her behalf? Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he had already reached precisely that conclusion. I believe, Miss Marple replied, that we are observing a situation in which multiple individuals have engaged in deception regarding their involvement in events surrounding Gerald Thistleton's death. Rachel Wickham was assaulted by Thomas Wickham, of that we can be reasonably confident. But who administered the barbiturates to Gerald Thistleton remains considerably less clear. Sophie Ashton claims responsibility, Blackwood said. Sophie Ashton claims responsibility, Miss Marple agreed, but her claim derives from a confession made to her father, not from direct statement to the authorities. What if Sophie witnessed the poisoning but did not perpetrate it? What if she assumed responsibility for actions undertaken by someone else, motivated by either family loyalty or genuine confusion regarding the sequence of events? Inspector Blackwood rose and began to pace, his motion suggesting the internal processes of investigation undertaken under conditions of profound complexity. You're suggesting that someone other than Sophie Ashton administered the barbiturates? Someone with access to Thistleton's residence? Someone with knowledge of dosage? Someone with sufficient sophistication to stage an apparent suicide? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that we have been focusing our investigation upon the wrong suspects. We have concentrated upon Rachel Wickham's assault and Gerald Thistleton's death as though they constitute the entirety of the criminal activity in Riverside. But what if they are merely symptoms of a larger pattern? What if the assault and the murder represent two manifestations of a single underlying conflict involving individuals we have not yet adequately considered? Inspector Blackwood departed Miss Marple's cottage at dusk, carrying with him the particular burden of investigation that has begun to consume itself through excessive complexity. Miss Marple remained in her sitting room as evening descended, reviewing mentally the various facts that had been established thus far, examining them against the patterns she had observed throughout her decades of social observation. The assault on Rachel Wickham had been committed by Thomas Wickham in a moment of passionate distress upon discovering her pregnancy. This appeared credible, supported by his own admission and by the physical evidence. But Gerald Thistleton's death presented complications that suggested deeper patterns of motivation and involvement. She rose from her chair and moved to her writing desk, withdrawing a sheet of paper upon which she began to record the various movements of the individuals present at Mrs. Pemberton's garden party. She noted the times, the observed behaviors, the inconsistencies between stated intentions and observable actions. And gradually, through the process of arranging facts into coherent sequence, a pattern began to emerge that possessed the particular clarity of truth finally asserting itself against the confusion of deception. It was not Sophie Ashton who had poisoned Gerald Thistleton. It was not Margaret Harrison, consumed by decades-old resentment seeking violent outlet. It was someone considerably closer to the events, someone whose involvement had been obscured by the very mechanisms of deception that others had employed to conceal their own guilt. The following morning, Miss Marple contacted Inspector Blackwood and requested his presence at her cottage. When he arrived, she had prepared tea and positioned herself in her sitting room with the particular composure of someone about to deliver information of considerable consequence. "I have been considering the sequence of events," she began without preamble, "and I believe I've identified a critical inconsistency that resolves the question of Gerald Thistleton's true murderer. You see, Inspector, what we have been observing is not multiple independent crimes, but rather a single crime that has acquired increasingly elaborate layers of deception as various individuals have attempted to conceal their knowledge or involvement." "Please continue," Blackwood urged, his notebook already positioned to receive whatever revelation Miss Marple might provide. Thomas Wickham struck Rachel Wickham at the garden gate because he had discovered her pregnancy and believed himself to be the father. This action was committed in a moment of passionate distress and subsequently regretted, which explains Rachel's willingness to protect him from formal accusation. However, Thomas Wickham is not the father of Rachel's child. The father is Gerald Thistleton, who had engaged in a calculated seduction of a young woman with limited social protection and considerable financial vulnerability. "Established," Blackwood acknowledged. "Subsequently," Miss Marple continued, "Dr. Harrison discovered his daughter's involvement in administering barbiturates to Gerald Thistleton. He confessed to the authorities on behalf of his wife, Sophie, and simultaneously arranged for his wife to consume barbiturates in a quantity sufficient to render her unconscious. This action was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously, to provide legal justification for his wife's absence during formal interrogation, to create the appearance that Margaret Harrison had taken her own life in response to the murder investigation, and to provide himself with the role of devoted husband attempting to prevent his wife from facing criminal charges. "But Sophie Ashton confessed to administering the poison?" Blackwood protested. "Sophie Ashton confessed to actions that she observed, but did not herself perpetrate," Miss Marple replied. "She witnessed someone administering barbiturates to Gerald Thistleton and assumed responsibility for that action. However, Sophie's timeline places her at Thistleton's residence at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening. The barbiturates in Thistleton's system suggest they were administered considerably earlier, during the afternoon hours when the garden party was in progress. Understanding began to crystallize in Blackwood's expression. Someone administered the poison during the garden party itself. Someone who had access to Thistleton's residence or to his person during the afternoon. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. And someone who possessed access to barbiturates, knowledge of appropriate dosage, and sufficient motivation to ensure Thistleton's permanent removal from the world. Someone who had observed Rachel Wickham's assault, understood its implications, and decided that Thistleton required elimination before he could inflict additional damage upon the vulnerable individuals within Riverside's social sphere. The vicar, Blackwood whispered. Reverend Ashton, Sophie's grandfather, he would have known about the pregnancy, would have possessed medical knowledge through his pastoral duties, would have had opportunity during the garden party to position himself near Thistleton. The vicar, Miss Marple confirmed, who has spent decades in a position requiring him to counsel victims of human predation while simultaneously counseling their victimizers to seek redemption and forgiveness. A man who had likely witnessed Thistleton's manipulations on numerous occasions, who understood that Thistleton would never face genuine consequences through legal or social mechanisms, and who finally decided that divine justice required his intervention. But he would have needed to administer the poison without detection, Blackwood said, his investigative mind already working through the logistics of such action, which is precisely why he utilized the garden party as cover, Miss Marple explained. During the confusion of the gathering, the vicar positioned himself near Thistleton's brandy. He had learned through his granddaughter that Thistleton kept a flask of brandy in his study at Riverside Manor, a fact Sophie had discovered during her visit. The vicar possessed duplicate keys to the manor, acquired decades earlier when he had served as temporary chaplain during a period when the previous owner had been incapacitated by illness. So the vicar administered the poison during the garden party, allowing Thistleton to return home believing himself unharmed, Blackwood said slowly. The barbiturates would have taken effect hours later, during the evening hours, creating the appearance that Thistleton had consumed poison at his residence rather than during the social gathering. And when Sophie subsequently visited Thistleton to confront him regarding Rachel's pregnancy, she discovered him already dead or dying. She assumed responsibility for his death, either to protect her grandfather or to provide herself with a narrative that seemed less accusatory than the truth. Dr. Harrison then confessed on behalf of both his wife and his daughter, creating layers of confusion that would obscure the vicar's actual involvement. Inspector Blackwood rose from his chair with the expression of a man confronting the particular tragedy that accompanies genuine insight. "I must arrest Reverend Ashton." "You must," Miss Marple agreed quietly, "though I suspect the vicar will not resist such arrest. He has spent 70 years attempting to prevent human suffering through spiritual counsel. He finally decided that prevention required more direct intervention. He will likely accept the consequences of his action with the same equanimity with which he has faced all other challenges." As Blackwood departed to accomplish his unpleasant duty, Miss Marple returned to her garden and her roses, contemplating the particular tragedy of human justice and the various ways in which moral complexity resists legal simplification.